Joining me now, Times columnist Hugo Rifkind and Sarah Ditum from the Sunday Times. Thank you both very much indeed for joining me. Maybe I'll start with you, Sarah. You've obviously been part of this investigation. It's been a long time coming. I wonder what you make of the response to it so far and the kind of clamour and the din and the noise surrounding it, and whether any of it adds up to much so far.
Well, I shouldn't say I've been part of the investigation. That has been done by very diligent investigative journalists on Dispatches, the Sunday Times, and the Times. And I was not one of the people who were involved in the really rigorous work that it took to break this story. In terms of whether it adds up to much, I think it adds up to an enormous number of questions about how someone was allegedly able to operate with huge impunity, being enabled by large corporations, which were not only failing to arrest his behaviour, but according to some of the allegations, actually enabling it. And the stuff that was on the screen, I think, revisited now, is in many ways seems almost as shocking as some of the allegations about off-screen behaviour. And so there are certainly questions to ask about what kinds of standards were being applied and why broadcasters were not being more diligent in patrolling the boundaries.
Is it, though, a kind of barrage of almost posthumous shock about somebody whose stock in trade was being shocking? He would say or do something shocking, and oh, how we laughed. The audience clamoured for more, bosses clamoured for more. He was big business and a success for them. If he hadn't been, they wouldn't have done, but because he was, they provided more and more of him because that was what was wanted. And is it absolutely, shutting the stable door after the horse was bolted all these years later to appear to be shocked at the fact that he was shocking? That was the whole point of him, wasn't it?
Well, I think it's important to recognise and not to sort of flatter ourselves that, everybody saw through him all the time and he was always obviously over the line. People did enjoy the shock. They did enjoy the envelope pushing. There was a big appetite for it. And it was very popular and successful. One of the reasons he had so much power within the broadcasters he worked in was because he was popular. He brought in ratings. The public enjoyed him. So, yeah, I think that's true to an extent. And I also think the fact is that what we know about other people in the public eye who have had allegations against them proven, like, for example, Jimmy Savile or the singer R. Kelly, is that people have been able to use very exaggerated, heightened, sort of sexualized personas as a sort of a cover against heightened sexualized behavior in their private lives. So there is a tendency, I think, for people to have seen really exaggerated kinds of behavior and performance and assumed that that meant everything was a joke and that it would kind of sanitize everything that happened and apply the sort of sheen of irony to behavior that is, looked at quite coldly, deeply unacceptable.
I mean, I don't know whether anyone could accuse Russell Brand or anybody who liked him of using the word sanitised, or indeed thinking anything was sanitised. It was so deeply sordid and incredibly detailed, the kind of revelations that he made about his sex life, both on stage and on screen. Sanitised, pasteurised or served up in an acceptable way were not the situation at all. It was far from that. I suppose what was notable about it was what he himself says now, this transparency or possible semblance of transparency, where he was brutally kind of to the absolute most revolting biological detail honest, it appeared, about what was going on and what he was doing. Therefore, it was not assumed that there was a veil of secrecy from somebody who was being so unbelievably candid about things.
I think people can sometimes mistake openness for can sometimes mistake open confession for salvation. They assume that if someone is telling you all this stuff, it means that they're somehow above it and that they would not seriously, anyone who has the self-awareness to talk about these things couldn't actually be acting in these kinds of way, or anyone who is performing this for the camera couldn't be acting in in unacceptable ways off camera. And that's obviously not true, but I think there's always this desire to be in on the joke, which leads to a temptation not to take things seriously, to treat things as a joke when, they actually signal quite serious behaviours.
Let's bring Hugo Rifkind into the discussion. You've written a very interesting piece about this, Hugo. Thank you for joining me. And what's your position on this kind of juxtaposition of extreme candour, agonisingly painful, utterly revolting honesty, with a potential for not being honest at all, or indeed, shielding people from what might really, at least it is alleged, have gone on?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the comedy Russell Brand was doing back in the 2000s, which is very different from what he does now. And what's striking about it, I mean, one of the first things I thought when watching back a lot of this stuff was how similar it is to the language used by people like Andrew Tate today, that we all rightfully get sort of furious and upset about and condemnatory about. It was just sort of run of the mill back then. It was seen as a joke. It was taken as a joke. There weren't really any avenues for people to make a fuss if they found it disgusting. It was just something that was part of the scene. And his behavior, I guess, his sort of more upsetting behavior, his nasty behavior, sort of was as well. It just sort of vanished amid the noise. It was I mean, I'm hesitant to say it was a more sexist time, but it was certainly a time that was more brazen in its sexism. And he spoke in a way, and he behaved in a way that kind of sort of vanished amid the noise of the early 2000s, and it's quite shocking to look back at it now.
And he was embraced, wasn't he, publicly by all manner of establishment figures, not simply Radio 2, which you might imagine was the bastion of family feel-good broadcasting. At least it certainly was. I worked there for 12 years. That's what we were told we were doing there. That's what I thought it was all about. But also by Ed Miliband, by Alistair Campbell, by all manner of the cognoscenti, the intelligentsia, politicos, and people who, it's suggested today, might have known better, but certainly didn't then.
Well, again, it was another age. I mean, yes, he had a column in The Guardian, he guest edited The New Statesman, and so on and on it went. But I mean, it was a slightly different time, and that people didn't. I mean, these days, if someone appears in public in some sort of new role, people will pore over their past comments and find reasons why they're not suitable to be there, which is sometimes a great thing to do, and sometimes quite a sort of damaging and pointless thing to do. With him, I think maybe people should have done that a little bit more. It's remarkable when you think that Ed Miliband went to pay court on him. It's remarkable the way he got to speak to Jeremy Paxman, where when Paxman's first question wasn't these jokes you made on stage about the kind of sex you like having, is that all right? And why should we take seriously what you think about voting when this is your attitude towards how you should treat other human beings? But it was not the time. It was not how we behaved. It was not how anyone behaved. It wasn't what the media regarded its role as being.
I mean, looking back on it, and I was a kind of part of it because I was frequently a guest on a show that he presented, and I formed a friendship with him, and I got to observe him at close quarters, and I would dispute the notion that anything at all was happening in plain sight other than what he said was happening in plain sight. So it was known that he was having sex with multiple women, and he said so, and it was apparent that that was going on. But the kind of prevailing thought was these are women who were only too thrilled to bits to do that. They are empowered women of the 90s and noughties who are entitled to make their own sexual choices, and their sexual choices to have sex willingly and with consent with Russell Brand. I don't think anything else was happening in plain sight other than that.
Sure, but even that, I mean, today, if you had a TV host of his prominence and the story emerged that he was having members of his production staff pick women he fancied out the audience to meet him afterwards, that he was behaving in that kind of way routinely, let alone some of the other stuff that he's now been accused of. I mean, that would be career ending. Whereas then it sort of, as we say, it vanished in the noise. And so no wonder he felt he could sort of behave with absolute impunity. Everyone behaved with absolute impunity. And the kind of the savagery that he is said to have behaved with towards women is pretty similar to how the media sort of behaved towards pretty much everyone back then, as I'm sure you know very well yourself, Vanessa.
I do.
And so there just wasn't the same notion of care and responsibility towards the victims of anything.
And I wonder, though, whether there really is now or not. Do you think, Sarah, it's a different time now? Do you think this kind of thing wouldn't be laughed at in the same way or tolerated in the same way? Certainly, Russell Brand's audience on Saturday night, all 2,000 of them stood up, gave him a standing ovation, roared with approbation at every syllable he uttered. There's a huge appetite for him and his work and his thoughts still now, isn't there?
Well, he's deliberately cultivated a very different audience to the one that he had in the 90s and noughties. He has reinvented himself as a guru figure who has a very niche audience who are very attracted to his, the kind of conspiracies that he tells them about. And he has sort of fashioned himself as a kind of a leader who has a direct relationship with his fans via social media, which is not something that was really readily available to a public figure at the time he first achieved fame in the 90s and noughties. So I think in some ways, the allegations around his behaviour, it would be harder to replicate those things probably within broadcasting. I think you would have a lower tolerance from some of the crew about those things. And I think women have more vocabulary to talk about concepts like grooming, like coercive control, that makes it possible to recognize damaging behaviors rather than just feel completely steamrolled by them. But at the same time, you have these other, number one, like, it's still not impossible for people within traditional media to act unacceptably, and there are various cases currently under investigation that show that very strongly. And number two, you have the kinds of arenas that Brand has moved into on social media. You have YouTube, TikTok, where you have direct relationships with fans, and genuinely deeply disturbing stories about grooming and exploitation coming out of around public figures working in those arenas, that I just think shows that behaviours, exploitative behaviours will simply find new avenues, and you have to exercise constant vigilance in order to prevent people from behaving exploitatively.
Let me ask Hugo about this idea of stars being entitled to a certain sort of rarefied, etiolated worship and treatment. So, you're a big star, you've got tremendous charisma, the whole production's riding on your back, because without you, they haven't got it. Without you, there is no show. You are the show. And therefore, traditionally, the star gets looked after, kowtowed to. Everybody knows about these ridiculous riders where you can demand to have a dressing room full of small white kittens, or, a certain kind of vintage of champagne. And everyone's only too thrilled to bits to give you whatever you want, because the happier you are, the better the performance. And there's a kind of atmosphere of worship, adulation, and terror around very many very, very famous people in the world, isn't there? And I wonder if it's inevitable.
Well, I mean, I'll say with some regret, that's not quite how they treat me at Times Radio, although
Shame.
maybe in time, who knows? Yes, look, this obviously happens. I mean, this has always happened. It happened with with Hollywood stars and with rock stars, and with back in the day, it used to happen with authors, although that's rare these days. I think, I mean, another aspect of the Russell Brand story is that when a lot of these allegations took place, sure, some of them were in Hollywood and Los Angeles. A lot of them were just when he was working for the BBC in London, and it shows that stars were much less stars were much more stellar back then. There was a much greater separation, as Sarah says, between performers and their audience. He could behave like a rock star while being a frankly sort of middle-ranking comedian on a minority channel. It's just what happened, So I mean, all that, it was a slightly different time. Obviously, stars are still indulged in ways they shouldn't be by production teams who are frightened that they'll leave them otherwise. But I haven't experienced anything or even come across anything remotely similar to the kind of treatment that was lavished on him in really quite a long time.